Maryanne, welcome back to the podcast. It's great to have you with us. We are talking about your latest column for Maxim, Health Providers' Rights Facing a Dead End. Now, this comes on the back of the obligatory review of our 2021 euthanasia legislation appearing, as you put it, silently online last week in the middle of a very busy news week. It was dropped to very little or maybe zero fanfare. And it starts by saying that the legislation has been operating largely well. Tell us a bit more about that. You've done a deep dive into this and written your column about it. So tell us a bit more about what the review said past the opening line.
Yeah, it did say that it was largely operating well. Last time we chatted, I was talking about equally cheerful stuff,
Yes.
which was
the review committee, I
was
think, is what we were talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, 2 of the 3 original committee members publicly shared their alarm with the way things were operating. So that was depressing news. Things weren't operating well.
Yes.
And that's the reason they were no longer part of the review committee.
Yeah, and I think we speculated on what this review might say, given the public outcry, or sorry, the public speaking out of those members.
Yeah, and the way that the response they'd had from the ministry indicated the way the ministry's review of euthanasia was going to go.
Yeah. When
they said there isn't enough information on some of these reports, this is people who are already dead, for us to know whether anything has been untoward, the ministry told them just to assume everything was okay if there was no information recorded.
Yes, I remember
And
that.
this review, it very much assumes that the best possible outcome, is likely. Yeah. And the list of recommendations it makes to tighten things up says completely the opposite.
Okay. So they say at the start, things are largely operating well, but if we wanted them to operate well, we would do these things here. So there's kind of a two-way kind of a thing.
Kind of mentioned that there are a small number of potential breaches, so not admitting that any were. One has been referred to the police.
Okay.
We know from the review committee, as we discussed last time, that somebody who potentially had dementia, definitely didn't speak English, and definitely didn't have an interpreter in the consultation, somehow was euthanized.
Yeah.
So to say that there are potential breaches, and then to look at the list of recommendations they would like to put in place, you've got to say this is not good legislation and it's not been operating well. And the fact that we don't know exactly what's gone wrong is only a function of poor recording of the details. It's completely unknown what a lot of people actually experienced. So the positives in the review, I'd say, are that if the recommendations get put into law, it could minimize breaches. Now, you'd have to get bills passed for any or all of these recommendations. So in the meantime, we're living without them. And there are things like training for people who provide euthanasia.
Okay. I thought that would have been like something that was there already.
Medical professionals, they can just add this to their toolkit, no problem. Detailing what the registrar who looks over cases before people are actually euthanized, and the review committee who we heard from before, and they review things after the fact, actually specifying what their role is and what power they have. So for the registrar, they're suggesting that the registrar, seeing that there are gaps, can say, don't proceed until this and this has been satisfied. Apparently at the moment they can't.
Wow.
Yeah, so like that's carrying on. The registrar can look at things and go, I don't like this, and somebody can carry on and be euthanized anyway.
So it's like an oversight committee without any oversight powers, really.
Exactly.
The box
and the
ticking
review committee
exercise,
Yes. In fact, box ticking exercise is exactly what the review committee former members called it. So there's, training that And then they have a lot of recommendations that, in their own words, they consider that the balance of rights should favor the rights of consumers accessing healthcare. And if you break down some of those words, there's debate whether that's the way we should be.
Well, I don't consider myself a consumer of healthcare. Yeah.
So what they like to do is things like remove things that slow down the process. So there's generally a wait time. New Zealand's is not long. It's on average at the moment 3 weeks to get approved and another 3 weeks to have it take place. And so half the time it's shorter than that. Yeah. Half the time it's, roughly longer. So that's not a long time to wait. They like to remove some of the hurdles that might make it longer. And the rationale, interestingly, is that some people end up dying a natural death before they can access euthanasia. And that would not seem like a problem, given that euthanasia, the purpose is to end someone's life.
Yeah.
Repeatedly in the review, this is raised as a problem. If somebody who wants euthanasia dies first and they don't get to have euthanasia, then somehow the health system has failed.
Yeah, like they got away or something like that. My gosh, what the
when you start to think what that mindset reflects, that colors the whole report. And so the consideration that this is a consumer rights issue and that people should be able to access it at all costs. At the moment, people who have a 6-month prognosis and are suffering, there's a member's bill in the wings that, if it comes forward, could remove the 6-month prognosis, and then you're opening this up to many other reasons, and that's a bridge to cross if it hopefully never appears, because as it is, the 166 pages in this report just opens can of worms after can of worms, and that would make it even messier. But that attitude that we must remove any barriers to anyone anywhere accessing it. They say it doesn't line up with other health services at the moment because there are these barriers. Well, the barriers are safeguards for other people, because there are other people involved than just the person who wants euthanasia.
Yes.
And there's no nice answer to a lot of these cases, because if someone is suffering horribly at the end of their life, which is not always the case, I think Hollywood has colored our view of death.
Yes.
If someone is, and if pain care that's available doesn't do its job, yes, there are these exceptions that are very hard stories to hear. We shouldn't be writing legislation for the exceptions, however, and then we shouldn't push that legislation to the point that it then impinges on the rights of other people. Examples of that are the recommendations want to make it mandatory for care facilities to allow residents to be euthanized on site. Now, a lot of these care facilities are privately run, and you've got other rights involved, such as those who work there who may not want to work in an environment where people are getting assisted suicide. And people who live there might not want to live in a place. Now, one of the options that they wrote they had but opted not to pursue was they could have said in the recommendation that they'd like to see these care facilities say up front when someone's admitted, if you'd like to access euthanasia someday, you aren't able to do it here. So just, like any service, say, any place you stay, there are things you can do and can't do there.
Yeah.
Any kind of healthcare that, you go to a facility, there are things they do offer and don't offer. That would have been fair enough. So if somebody wanted to have that option open to them, then they'd know, I need to look for somewhere else to stay, or in this place, I'll be limited. I might have to be moved to a hospital or somewhere first. The recommendation goes all the way and wants to mandate these facilities.
Oh, man.
Similarly, with medical care professionals. Medical professionals now, the majority do not offer euthanasia. And in fact, most don't want to. Yeah. And when it comes to medical professionals who, their opinions on euthanasia, the vast majority of palliative care specialists are not in favor of offering euthanasia.
Which so this is not in like itself, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Same with disability rights people.
Yeah.
They are the most likely to be opposed to this
Yeah.
kind of legislation. That tells you something.
Yeah.
So the constant wording that this is like any other healthcare, it's not. And the assumption that it should be offered to the same level of all other healthcare. Well, there are reasons why we actually don't want that. The recommendation that doctors be allowed to raise the topic of euthanasia, which currently they're not supposed to. I know that they do because I've heard from someone whose friend had their doctor, after a rough diagnosis, then tell her, this is, and started introducing the idea of ending her life, which really messed with her head. So they're not supposed to do that for that reason. I mean, we don't publish media don't publish details of suicides because suicide contagion is a thing. Putting the idea of maybe you could end your life in someone's head is a pretty heavy thing, especially when you're talking about people who are vulnerable.
Yeah. Had a big diagnosis or some massive news, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, there is a way out of this if you really want, we could go down this path.
I know of a couple of people whose friends have been blindsided by doctors suggesting it. So there's a really good reason why at the moment doctors are only allowed to bring that up in end-of-life conversations if the patient first asks about it. The rationale for removing that is that it's, again, a consumer rights issue. They should know all their options. I think that is a very sus argument because we've had a couple years of debate around euthanasia, public referendum that people voted on. It's come into law and there's been press coverage about the whole thing. So this assumption that there might be people who don't know about it. I mean, I'm sure there are people who don't, but what's riskier? That they never bring it up because they didn't realize it was an option and they die a natural death, or that you have doctors putting the idea of, maybe it's time you should think about killing yourself in the heads of patients.
Yeah.
It undermines doctor-patient trust. It messes with people's heads. This is not healthcare like other healthcare. This is not preserving life. So the constant wording in this review, I think, is starting from a false assumption that this is healthcare like any other. Now, the conscientious objection that doctors are by rights allowed to is also being undermined because they're not proposing forcing all doctors to participate. That's never going to be a thing, I don't think, because not everybody offers all services.
Hopefully, yeah.
But for those who have conscientious objection, they want to remove the ability for doctors to say, sorry, I don't offer that. Here's the ministry's service that, has information about it. And the patient can go off and get information from the Ministry of Health directly or Health New Zealand. They want to remove that. And so the doctor has to make sure that they have a pathway to access it, and that when the patient is reviewed for euthanasia, they volunteer all the information that is needed instead of going, look, I'm out. This is, I don't agree with ending somebody's life. I'm not going to be part of this. They're going to be forced to be part of it, with the rationale being, hey, if you're not the one administering the lethal drugs, you shouldn't have any problem with anything else.
Yeah. Oh, man. Okay, so that's kind of a bit of a deeper dive into the report. What's your prognosis for us coming out of this, Maryanne? Where do you see this going in the future? How are we looking?
It is hard to predict because any changes are going to be down to, like members' bills. At the moment, like I said, there's the one that would remove the 6-month prognosis and create many more cans of worms. If somebody wants to take up any of these recommendations, then they could be considered. I don't know. Nobody knows what the timeline would be on that.
Yeah. Because the recommendations aren't going to be automatically instituted, right? There's no power for them to say, government, you have to produce a bill.
Legislation. No,
the
legislation says exactly the way it is.
Bill. Oh, man.
Yeah. With all its problems and with all its safeguards, it remains as it is for now. And I mean, the review shows that there are a lot of problems. And even though it says it's working well, then it goes through a whole list of things that ideally would change and proposes a whole bunch of things that, if they changed, would undermine other people's rights.
Wow, that's a big topic for us, Maryanne. Probably the best thing that people can do is keep an eye on this, talk to their MPs about it. Any other suggestions that you have if people want to get involved in this sort of part of the legislation?
I think just being aware of what is actually involved in this is good. And I don't expect many people to read all 166 pages. I haven't read every word myself yet. But just being aware that there are rights issues and that the Ministry of Health's attitude towards different people's rights is not the same. Some rights are being heavily preferred over others. And the other thing to be aware of is that the wording around euthanasia, normalizing it as any other type of health care, the report itself in one place acknowledges that it has significant differences in method and in outcome. That's just mentioned in passing, but we need to keep that in mind in all these discussions and not let the meaning of words be changed for us.
Yeah. So being vigilant in this and just making sure that we're aware of what's happening. And Maryanne, thank you for being with us, talking about this big topic. We'll continue to keep an eye on it. I know you'll be continuing to keep an eye on it and letting us know as any developments go forward. But thanks for being with us today, Maryanne.
Thanks so much, Jason. While the country's attention was fixed on the hikoi's arrival at Parliament, the Ministry of Health's obligatory review of 2021's euthanasia legislation silently appeared online. It reveals a tug-of-war between preserving safeguards for the vulnerable and actively increasing access. And though it acknowledges the need for better safeguards, recommendations repeatedly favor expansion. The review begins by saying that the legislation has largely been operating well, which is accurate in the sense that 978 people who successfully applied to end their lives are now dead. By any other definition, it has not. Recall that members of the ministry's own review committee expressed alarm at procedural gaps, with one saying they, quote, would not have known if someone had died wrongly, end quote. Nevertheless, in quotes, the ministry is confident that everyone who has received an assisted death met the eligibility requirements set out in the Act and had chosen an assisted death, end quote. This is qualified by an oblique reference to a small number of potential breaches, one of which has been referred to the police. The review's recommendations include defining the responsibilities of the registrar and review committee so that they have the power to minimize such breaches, training for medical practitioners, specifying what patient examinations should entail, and creating specific offenses in the Crimes Act. With these basic considerations absent from the current legislation, no wonder there have been breaches. The ministry is still keen to abolish safeguards in the interest of access, though. Currently, doctors cannot discuss euthanasia with eligible patients unless patients request it, a limitation the review calls out of step with how health services are usually provided. Health services, lest we forget, preserve life. Euthanasia is out of step by nature. The presence of neither drugs nor doctors changes the fact that suicide assistance can never be provided the way health services are. The review acknowledges this, then returns to advocating for equal access that universally beneficial services, such as palliative care, haven't achieved. The review recommends amending legislation so that doctors can, and even should, introduce euthanasia in discussions about end-of-life care. The rationale that consumers have a right to no options is flimsy. Euthanasia has been legal since 2021, and we've had a national referendum on the issue with years of media coverage. We all know it's an option. What's more harmful, someone dying a natural death because they missed the news, or someone with no desire to kill themselves being blindsided by a doctor suggesting they consider it? The reviewers would also mandate care facilities to allow euthanasia on site, with no consideration for residents' or workers' preferences. And they would compel doctors who object to assisting suicides to support euthanasia assessments for their patients and refer them to the assisted dying service. This reinterprets the conscientious objection rights in a cynically narrow way. It's a subtle but significant shift from practitioners and facilities must be free to provide euthanasia to practitioners and facilities must provide for euthanasia. And if we take that leap, how soon before the cultural consensus that certain types of patients should be free to choose euthanasia becomes certain types of patients should choose euthanasia?